long before the great palace gates of the east began to creak on their hinges, and before the old, tired empires felt the true weight of their own history, there was the Great Steppe. It was a sea of tall grass that stretched until the earth met the sky, a place where the only borders were the ones drawn by the wind. The people here did not live behind walls of stone. Their homes were made of felt and wood, packed away as the seasons shifted. They measured their lives not in years, but in the steady gait of their horses and the long migrations from winter camp to summer pasture. From the high country frost they learned endurance. From the shared cold of a desert night, they learned a loyalty that no gold could buy. At the time, they were just a people in motion, families, herdsmen and warriors. They did not yet know that their footsteps would soon shake the foundations of ancient cities, or that their choices would redraw the maps of 3 continents. This is the story of how a tribe of riders became the guardians of a faith and the architects of an empire. It is a story of how they changed the world, and how, in the quiet passage of time, the world they conquered slowly changed them in return. Before we begin this journey, if you find peace in these unhurried stories, I'd be honored to have you subscribe to Sleepy Timeline, and if you're listening tonight, please leave a quiet thought in the comments. Tell me which city you're in and what time it is where you are. I would love to read your messages. To understand how the Seljuks rose to power, we must leave the bustling markets and the crowded courts behind. We must go back to the silence of the grasslands, to a time when the air was still, just before the great banners were raised for the very first time. Long before the first ink was set to parchment to record these deeds, and before the Great Steppe had a name that could be found on a map, there was only the land. It was a world of immense, crushing silence, where time was measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow leaning of the grass beneath a relentless wind. In the heart of Central Asia, the earth seemed to spill outward in every direction. This was the home of the Oghuz Turks. Here, the steppe didn't just roll like an ocean. It was a harsh, physical presence that demanded everything from those who walked upon it. In the winters, the wind roared down from the Siberian wastes, turning the soil into iron and making a man's own breath feel like a jagged blade in his throat. In the short, blistering summers, the heat baked the earth until the horizon shimmered and blurred, rewarding only those with the patience to endure. Survival here was not a gift. It was a craft, handed down through generations. Across these vast, treeless spaces moved the Oghuz. They were a people of leather, wool and bone. They moved with the seasons, guided by the memory of where the water hid and where the grass grew thickest. Their homes were yurts, latticed wooden frames covered in heavy grey felt, that could be struck and packed onto the backs of camels in a single morning. At night, these camps glowed softly in the dark, smelling of wood smoke and dried horse milk. Around the fires, elders spoke to children in a tongue shaped by the rhythm of the trail. They did not build monuments of stone, for stone was heavy and stayed behind. Instead, they carried their history in their blood and their songs. They were warriors, herders and traders, men and women who understood the balance of power, not from books, but from the way a clan stood together when the wolves or a rival tribe circled the camp. But far to the west, beyond the red sands of the deserts and the jagged teeth of the mountains, a different kind of world was growing weary. In Baghdad, the city of peace, the air was thick with the scent of spices, old dust, and the weight of a dying era. For centuries, authority had pulsed outward from the centre like a steady heartbeat, but now that heart was faltering. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the sun around which the Islamic world turned, was fading into a long twilight. The Caliph still sat upon his throne, draped in black silk, but his shadow had grown long and thin. His voice, once law from the borders of India to the shores of the Atlantic, now struggled to reach the edges of his own palace gardens. In the provinces, the governors had stopped listening. Generals followed their own hunger for land. Power was no longer a solid thing. It had become brittle, fracturing quietly behind the closed doors of shaded courtyards. The gold coins still bore the caliph's name, but they brought less loyalty than they once did. In the markets and the mosques, people looked at one another with a silent, growing uncertainty. They could feel the foundation shifting beneath their feet, though no one could say exactly when the roof would finally fall. Between these two worlds, the wild, open steppe and the weary, walled cities, lay the lands of Persia and Anatolia. These were ancient places, burdened by the ghosts of empires long gone. Old Roman roads still cut through the dusty plains, and Persian fortresses watched over fertile valleys from the heights of the Zagros mountains. But the heirs to these lands were quarrelling. Local lords fought over scraps of territory, and borders moved like the shadows of clouds. In Persia, the great cities of Isfahan and Ray glimmered with gold and scholarship, yet their walls were guarded by men who wondered if their next paycheck would actually arrive. In Anatolia, the frontier was a jagged line of fortresses, where Byzantine soldiers peered eastward, watching a horizon that seemed increasingly unfamiliar. It was a world suspended in the moment before a great change, though it did not yet have a name for what was coming. In the quiet months between the seasons, when the moonlight turned the steppe into a silver sea, and the distant cities slept fitfully, something was beginning to move. It didn't start with a drum beat or a declaration of war. It started with small things, a drought in the north that pushed families toward the Sir Daria River, a new alliance sealed with a marriage between two clans, a young leader choosing a different path through the mountains. The Oghuz, and specifically the House of Seljuk, did not see themselves as the hands of destiny. They were responding to the ancient driving necessity of survival. They moved because they had to, but they carried with them a specific set of skills that the fractured world to the west had forgotten. A fierce, unbreakable discipline, a mobility that made walls irrelevant, and a loyalty forged in the fires of shared hardship. They had learned how to live in the in-between places, adapting to change without ever losing the core of who they were. Meanwhile, the people in the West, in the crumbling cities and the divided courts, were yearning for order. They didn't necessarily want peace, but they wanted a world that made sense again. They needed someone to bind the scattered pieces of authority back together, someone who could command not just through a title, but through the sheer weight of their presence. History has a way of drawing such worlds together. Across the thousands of miles of salt flats and mountain passes, the distance was closing. At night, beneath the cold stars of the steppe, the Oghuz elders spoke of the road ahead and the green lands of the south. In the palace chambers of Baghdad, officials whispered about the rising tide of riders appearing on their northern borders. The change was coming with a slow, gathering inevitability, not like a storm that breaks and vanishes, but like the rising of a winter sun. From the grasslands would come more than just a new army. There would come a new way of being. A tribe of riders shaped by the wind and the winter frost was about to step into the light of history. They would take the ancient stone of the West and the living spirit of the East and forge them into an empire that would endure for centuries. But for now, they were still just travellers, just families moving their herds beneath a sky that seemed to have no end. And the story was only just beginning to find its voice. As the first pale light of dawn touched the frost on the edge of the grasslands, two brothers, men whose names would soon be carved into the gates of 100 cities, began to lead their people out of the silence. They were stepping toward a destiny they could not yet name, into a world that was waiting for them to arrive. The steppe does not give out crowns. On the high grasslands of Central Asia, authority is not something you are born with. It is something you must carry on your shoulders through the long, freezing nights of winter. It is earned slowly, in the quiet spaces between migrations and the desperate moments of a raid. Among the Oghuz Turks, a man's word was only as strong as the trust his people placed in him. A trust forged over decades of finding water where the earth was dry and finding safety when the horizon was filled with enemies. The Oghuz were not a single solid nation. They were a loose gathering of many tents, a confederation of tribes bound by the same tongue and the same ancient customs, yet each fiercely proud of its own independence. They were like the grass itself, flexible, moving with the wind, but deeply rooted in the soil of their traditions. Every clan leader guarded his own, but they all understood one truth. When the land grew harsh or a rival grew too bold, they had to stand together or vanish into the silence of the plains. In this world, a leader's reputation travelled faster than any rider. It was carried in the stories told around evening fires, whispered from one camp to the next, until a name became a beacon. It was from this world of shifting dust and hard choices that two brothers rose, Tughril and Chaghri Beg. They were the grandsons of a man named Seljuk, and they had grown up in the shadow of his legacy. Their early years were not spent in palaces, but on the move, negotiating the narrow path between hunger and survival. Yet, even as young men, there was a weight to them that others noticed. While some saw only the next meal or the next grazing land, the brothers saw a horizon that stretched much further. Chaghri, the elder, was a man of the earth and the horse. He was patient, a master of the terrain who could read the moods of his warriors as easily as he could read the weather. Tughril was different, quieter, more resolute, with a steadiness in his eyes that made men stop and listen. They were two halves of a single whole, Chaghri looking outward toward the next tactical advantage, and Tughril looking inward, holding the many clans together with a calm, iron will. They didn't lead through loud commands, but through the quiet power of judgment. As the years passed, the pressures on the steppe began to change. The grazing lands were crowded, and the old alliances were fraying. To the south lay the lands of Khorasan, a region of ancient cities, deep irrigation canals, and wealth that the Oghuz had only heard of in travellers' tales. The brothers realized that the old ways were no longer enough. The future of their people required a crossing. This was not a sudden, violent invasion. It was a slow, massive tide of people. Thousands of families, millions of sheep, and endless lines of camels began to move southward. The brothers guided this migration with the care of shepherds. They sent warriors ahead to secure the mountain passes and envoys to speak with the local lords, trying to find a way forward where swords were not yet needed. Each river they crossed and each valley they secured added to their legend. Their people followed not because they were ordered to, but because, for the first time in generations, they felt they were going somewhere. Their true test arrived in the dry, sun-drenched plains of Khorasan. Khorasan was the doorway to the Persian world, a place where the Islamic faith and Persian culture met in a beautiful, if unstable, mix. The cities here, Merv, Nishapur and Herat, were prosperous, but they were also afraid. The old powers, like the Ghaznavids, had grown heavy and slow. Their rulers sat in marble halls, distant from the reality of the frontier. When Tughril and Chaghri led their riders into these lands, they didn't just find enemies, they found a house with a broken door. The conflict that followed reached its peak in the year 1040 at a place called Dandanaqan. The Seljuk riders were outnumbered and exhausted, facing the massive armoured elephants and the disciplined infantry of the Ghaznavid Sultan. But the brothers knew their strength. They used the desert itself as an ally, striking like the wind and disappearing before the heavy Ghaznavid troops could turn to face them. By the time the sun set over the dust-choked plains, the old order had been shattered. For the first time, the Oghuz were no longer just nomads looking for grass. They were the masters of a kingdom. But Tughril knew that winning a battle was not the same as winning a world. In the lands they now occupied, power was tied to something deeper than the sword. It was tied to the caliph in Baghdad. To the people of the cities, the Seljuks were still outsiders, barbarians from the north. To rule them, Tughril needed legitimacy. He needed the blessing of the Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual heart of the entire Islamic world. He moved with a diplomat's grace. He did not march on Baghdad to destroy it. He offered to protect it. He sent letters to the Caliph, al-Qaim, written with the respect of a student to a master. He promised to clear the roads of bandits, to restore the mosques, and to bring order to the chaos. When the recognition finally came, it changed everything. The Caliph acknowledged Tughril not just as a tribal chief, but as a legitimate sultan, the king of the East and the West. In that moment, the identity of the Oghuz transformed. They were no longer just the people of the tents. They were the Seljuks, the stewards of a new era. Chaghri remained in the east, securing the borders and ensuring the tribes remained loyal to their roots. Tughril moved westward, his presence felt in every city long before his riders actually appeared. Together they had built a bridge between two worlds. They had taken the raw, unbreakable spirit of the steppe and married it to the ancient, sophisticated traditions of the Persian court. They did not claim to be gods or legends. They simply continued to make the hard choices that a leader must make, judging when to strike, when to wait, and when to listen. As the sun began to set on their first years of rule, the quiet age of transition was over. The embers of their campfires had grown into a fire that would light the world for 100 years. The story of the Seljuks had truly begun, and the world would never be the same again. Power, once it has tasted the air of the open world, rarely settles back into stillness. For the Seljuks, the victory at Khorasan was not a place to rest. It was a doorway. The land had given them a treasury, a reputation, and the loyalty of thousands, but it had also shown them a daunting reality. Beyond the mountains of Khorasan lay the heart of Persia, a world of blue-tiled domes, intricate gardens, and traditions that had outlasted dozens of dynasties. It was a world where authority was not measured in horses but in ledgers, laws, and the loyalty of the city gates. Tughril Beg was a man of the steppe, but he possessed the foresight of a statesman. He understood a truth that many conquerors ignore. You can win a kingdom from the saddle, but you cannot rule it from there. The Seljuk advance into Persia was not a chaotic storm of fire and steel. Instead, it was a deliberate, almost cautious absorption. Tughril moved with a heavy foot, securing the ancient Silk Road routes, placing trusted garrisons in mountain passes and, most importantly, leaving the daily life of the people untouched. He knew that a merchant who could still trade and a farmer who could still harvest were far more valuable than a pile of ashes. Persian cities like Ray and Isfahan did not go silent when the Seljuk banners appeared on the horizon. Instead, they continued to hum. In the bazaars, the scent of saffron and roasted meat still filled the air. In the madrasas, the scratch of reed pens on parchment never stopped. The Seljuks, newcomers to the life of walled cities, did not barge in to destroy. They walked through the gates with a quiet, watchful curiosity. They saw a society governed by 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom, records of taxes, codes of justice, and the delicate art of diplomacy. Rather than burn this world, the Seljuks decided to live within it. In many cities, the local elites, men who had seen warlords come and go like summer dust storms, realized that these Turks were different. They offered something that had been missing for a century: stability. The new Seljuk rulers didn't care about erasing Persian culture. They wanted to use it. Persian administrators stayed at their desks and the complex machinery of the state kept turning. What had changed was the hand on the lever. Now the state was protected by the most formidable light cavalry the world had ever seen, led by a sultan who saw a future that stretched from the Oxus River to the Mediterranean Sea. As Seljuk shadow lengthened across the plateau, Tughril turned his eyes toward the west, toward Baghdad. Baghdad was no longer the shimmering jewel of Harun al-Rashid's day. Its walls were crumbling in places and its canals were choked with silt, but it remained the spiritual anchor of the world. For Tughril, Baghdad was not a target for plunder. It was a target for protection. Control of the city meant control of the story. Whoever held Baghdad held the keys to legitimacy in the eyes of every Muslim from Samarkand to Cordoba. The road to the city was paved with tension, not blood. Rival factions within the city maneuvered for position, and the caliph lived in a gilded cage of uncertainty. Tughril did not arrive as a barbarian at the gates. In the year 1055, he entered Baghdad almost like a pilgrim answering a call for help. His arrival was restrained, draped in the heavy formality of a protector. When the black banners of the Seljuks were raised alongside the banners of the Abbasids, it wasn't an act of defiance, it was an act of service. With Baghdad secured, a new kind of state was born, the Seljuk Sultanate. It was a partnership of necessity. The caliph remained the spiritual head, the commander of the faithful, while Tughril became the sultan, the master of the sword and the law. It was a division that worked. Faith was preserved, and governance was renewed. The Seljuks had found their place, not by breaking the world, but by fitting themselves into its ancient frame. Yet a growing empire needs more than just a sultan. It needs a brain. The Seljuks knew they were warriors, not accountants. To govern these vast, diverse lands, they turned to the Persian genius for administration. It was here that the Turkic sword met the Persian pen. Persian became the language of the court, the language of the records, and the language of high culture. This wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the ultimate wisdom of the Seljuks. They allowed the empire to breathe and function while they learned the complex art of being kings. At the center of this transformation stood one man who would define the age, Nizam al-Mulk. He was not a man of the sword, but his mind was as sharp as any blade. As the vizier, he was the architect of the Seljuk peace. He didn't think in terms of battles, he thought in terms of systems. He believed that an empire was held together not by fear, but by the steady, invisible weight of justice and order. Under his watchful eye, the government became a machine that moved with purpose. Nizam al-Mulk organized the taxes so they were fair and predictable. He built roads that were safe for a lone traveler with a bag of gold. He established the Nizamiya, a network of great universities to train the next generation of leaders. He knew that if you could shape the minds of the young, you wouldn't have to fight the rebellions of the old. The Seljuk court itself began to change. The rough gatherings of tribal chiefs evolved into a sophisticated institution where Turkic warriors rubbed shoulders with Persian poets and Arab scholars. Ceremonies became elaborate, and the Sultan began to dress in the heavy silks of a Persian king. There were some among the Oghuz who missed the simplicity of the steppe, the smell of the campfire and the freedom of the open road. They worried that the softness of the city would swallow their spirit. But Tughril and his heirs knew that survival meant adaptation. They didn't stop being Turks, they became imperial Turks. They remained flexible enough to absorb new ideas without dissolving. Across the empire, the results were undeniable. Trade began to flow again along the Silk Road, protected by Seljuk garrisons. Artisans in Isfahan found new markets for their silks, and scholars in Baghdad found new patrons for their books. The empire was no longer just a conquest, it was a shared project. Building an empire is rarely about the roar of the crowd. Most often, it happens in the quiet of a vizier's office, in the scratch of a pen on a ledger at dawn, and in the decision to fix a bridge rather than burn a village. The Seljuks were learning that the pen was just as essential as the sword. By the time Tughril Beg passed from this world, he left behind something that had seemed impossible only 40 years earlier. He had taken a tribe of wandering herdsmen and turned them into the masters of the East. The foundations were laid, the balance was struck, and the empire was ready. But to the west, an old rival was watching. The Byzantine Empire looked toward its eastern borders with a growing cold unease. The Seljuks had proven they could rule. Now, the world would learn if they could truly conquer the masters of the West. Arslan did not learn to lead in a classroom. He learned in the saddle, feeling the steady rhythm of a horse's heartbeat against his legs long before he ever felt the weight of a silk robe. His name, meaning the heroic lion, was not just a title. It was a description of a man who'd been shaped by the vibration of motion. He grew up in a world where a quiet horizon was often a warning, and where the only thing more valuable than a sharp blade was a cool head. From the elders of the Oghuz, he learned to read the language of the wind and the subtle shifts in the dust of the trail. Silence was his greatest teacher, and authority, when it finally rested on his shoulders, felt like a familiar armor he had been preparing to wear his entire life. He was the son of Chaghri Beg, born into a family that viewed power not as a prize to be hoarded, but as a heavy burden of responsibility. The legacy of his uncle Tughril and his father was a shadow that could have easily swallowed a lesser man, but Arslan did not simply walk in their footsteps, he widened the path. His rise to the throne was not marked by the typical noise of a conqueror, but by a patient, watchful attentiveness. He knew when to command, but more importantly, he knew when to listen. He observed the way a single act of justice in a small village could do more to secure a province than 1,000 soldiers ever could. He understood that while fear might win a city, only trust could keep it. When he took the throne in 1063, the Seljuk realm was a sprawling, uneven giant. It was a kingdom that stretched from the icy waters of the Oxus to the sun-baked fringes of the Mediterranean, and with that size came a constant humming strain. Borders were not lines on a map back then. They were living, breathing places where cultures collided. To the west, the Byzantine Empire watched the rising Seljuk tide with a mixture of arrogance and deep-seated fear. Arslan did not seek to burn the world down, but he knew that for his people to be secure, the frontier had to be stabilized. For years, the borderlands of Anatolia had been a place of shadows, marked by lightning-fast raids and small skirmishes that never quite broke out into full war. But Arslan was a man of precision. He moved his forces through the rugged, mountainous terrain with a speed that baffled the Byzantine commanders. His cavalry did not march, they flowed. They would appear where they were least expected, striking at a supply line or a lone fortress, only to vanish back into the hills before the heavy Byzantine infantry could even lace their boots. Arslan was probing, testing the strength of the ancient Roman walls and the resolve of the men who stood behind them. These were not the actions of a reckless warlord. Arslan carried a strict moral code into every camp. He demanded that his soldiers treat the local farmers and villagers with restraint, believing that a ruler who broke his word was no ruler at all. To him, the moral weight of conquest was real. The tension finally snapped in the summer of 1071. The Byzantine emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, decided that the Turkish problem had to be solved once and for all. He gathered a massive glittering army, a forest of spears and heavy shields, and marched eastward toward the fortress of Manzikert. The landscape near Manzikert was open, dusty, and deceptively quiet. As the two armies drew close, a heavy, hot stillness settled over the plains. On paper, the Byzantines should have won. They had the numbers, the heavy armor, and the weight of imperial history behind them. But Alp-Arslan had something the emperor lacked: an intimate understanding of his own men and a total lack of ego. On the morning of the battle, it is said that Alp-Arslan did something that would become a legend. He set aside his royal finery and dressed in a simple white robe. Some say it was his burial shroud. He tied up his horse's tail, a sign that he was ready for a fight to the death, and told his men that if he fell, the ground where he lay would be his grave. He wasn't a king looking down on his subjects. He was a warrior standing in the dust with his brothers. The battle was a masterclass in steppe warfare. The Seljuks used the crescent tactic, feigning a retreat to draw the heavy Byzantine centre out of position. As the sun began to set and the heat grew unbearable, the Byzantine lines began to fracture. Communication broke down. Rumours of betrayal spread through the emperor's ranks. In the chaos of the fading light, the Seljuk riders closed the circle. By nightfall, the impossible had happened. The Byzantine army was shattered, and Emperor Romanos himself was a prisoner in a Turkish tent. The moment Romanos was brought before Alp-Arslan is one of the most famous in history. The Sultan did not mock him. He did not put his foot on the emperor's neck. Instead, he treated him like a guest. According to the chronicles, Alp-Arslan asked, "What would you do if I were brought before you as a prisoner?" Romanos replied honestly, "Perhaps I would kill you, or exhibit you in the streets of Constantinople." Alp-Arslan smiled and said, "My punishment is far heavier. I forgive you, and I set you free." He offered the emperor terms of peace that were grounded in common sense: a ransom, a treaty, and the redrawing of a few borders. It was a message to the world. Power is truly found in the ability to be merciful. Manzikert was not just a military victory, it was the opening of a door. In the years that followed, the barrier between the steppe and the Anatolian plateau simply vanished. Turkic tribes began to drift deeper into the heart of what we now call Turkey, bringing their herds and their families to settle in the valleys. It wasn't a sudden collapse of civilization, but a slow, quiet transformation. A village would wake up to find a new neighbour. A fortress would trade its Byzantine garrison for a Seljuk one. Arslan did not spend his remaining days basking in his glory. He returned to the grueling work of ruling. He focused on the Nizamiya schools, making sure that the children of his empire were as sharp with their pens as his soldiers were with their bows. He made the courts accessible to the poor, and he punished officials who grew fat on bribes. His authority was built on a foundation of trust so deep that even when he was far away on campaign, his empire remained steady. But the life of a lion is often cut short. In 1072, during a campaign in the east, a moment of uncharacteristic hesitation led to his death at the hands of a captured rebel. It was a sudden, quiet end for a man who had survived 100 battles. He left behind a kingdom that was strong, but he also left a void that only a truly great successor could fill. Alp-Arslan had secured the land, but now the Seljuks had to learn how to turn that land into a golden age. The heroic lion was gone, but the door he had kicked, open at Manzikert, would stay open forever, changing the map of the world in the course of history. When the lion of Manzikert, Alp-Arslan, passed from this world, the empire he built did not pause to mourn. In the 11th century, power was a restless thing. It did not allow for stillness. Across the vast Seljuk domains, governors watched the horizon, wondering if the central sun had finally set. Armies stood by their banners, waiting for a signal, and scholars in distant libraries whispered about whether the hard-won peace would crumble into dust. Succession was always a moment of quiet, held breath, a dangerous transition where an empire could either solidify or shatter. Malik Shah was only 18 years old when the weight of the world was placed upon his shoulders. He was young, yes, but he had spent his youth in the shadow of giants, watching his father balance the blade of the conqueror with the mercy of a king. While Arslan had been the warrior who broke the gates open, Malik Shah was something different. He was less severe, more contemplative. His strength didn't lie in the thunder of a cavalry charge, but in a deep, instinctive hunger for harmony. He understood a truth that few young kings ever grasp, that an empire's true survival depends not on how much land you take, but on how well you tend to what you already hold. The challenges came almost immediately. Ambition is a disease that strikes when a throne is new, and rival claimants soon tested the young sultan's resolve. But Malik Shah did not panic. Guided by the steady hand of his father's old advisors, he moved with a calm assurance that defied his age. He rewarded those who stayed loyal and met his enemies with a firm, measured hand. He didn't need grand spectacles of violence to prove he was in charge. He simply acted with such clarity that the world accepted him. With the internal fires dampened, the empire began to breathe outward. Under Malik Shah, Seljuk influence flowed into Syria, Iraq, and deeper into the heart of Persia. But these were not the frantic, bloody conquests of the past. This was consolidation. Malik Shah didn't just want to see his name on a map. He wanted the map to mean something. He wove local rulers into the fabric of the state, turning former enemies into partners. Administration followed the army, ensuring that when the dust of a campaign settled, schools, markets, and courts rose in its place. What truly defined Malik Shah's reign, however, was not the size of the territory, but the golden peace that settled over it. For the first time in generations, the roads were safe. A traveller could walk from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of India with a purse of gold and sleep soundly in a caravanserai without fear of bandits. Trade, the lifeblood of the world, began to flow without interruption. Cities like Isfahan and Merv grew fat and beautiful, their markets overflowing with silks from China, spices from the islands, and glass from the Levant. At the centre of this world stood the great vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. He was the architect of this era. Where the Sultan was the soul of the empire, Nizam al-Mulk was its mind. He believed that a kingdom was held together not by the thickness of its walls, but by the fairness of its laws. He worked tirelessly to turn the rough, tribal energy of the Turks into a sophisticated, functioning government. He didn't believe in innovation for its own sake. He believed in continuity. He trained a generation of officials to be honest and efficient, and he made sure that the poor had a place to bring their grievances. Education became the bedrock of this order. Across the empire, from the high plateaus of Anatolia to the river valleys of Iraq, the Nizamiya madrasas began to rise. These were not just religious schools, they were the universities of the age. Here, under the shade of arched courtyards, the greatest minds of the century gathered. They debated law, they mapped the stars, and they explored the deep questions of philosophy. To Malik Shah and his vizier, knowledge was a stabilizing force, a way to ensure that the men running the empire were guided by reason rather than just the sword. The physical world began to reflect this confidence. Architecture reached a level of measured elegance that had never been seen before. Great mosques rose with lines so clean they seemed to pull the eye toward the heavens. Madrasas were built with quiet courtyards designed for reflection, their brickwork forming complex geometric patterns that spoke of an orderly universe. And along the trade routes, the caravanserais, the great fortified inns, stood as statements of the Sultan's promise that the state would protect those who moved the world's wealth. In this environment, Persian culture did not just survive, it flourished. It became the language of the heart and the court. The Seljuks, once the rough riders of the steppe, had become the proud custodians of a civilization they once only viewed from afar. They didn't lose their identity as Turks, but they expanded it, blending the resilience of the grasslands with the refinement of the city. A soldier might pray in a mosque designed by a Persian architect, while a scholar might advise a Turkic prince using the words of ancient poets. The empire didn't erase the differences between people. It organized them into a beautiful, functioning whole. Malik Shah himself remained a man of quiet dignity. He avoided the flashy extravagance that usually destroys young kings. He preferred a long discussion with a scientist or a poet to a loud celebration in a banquet hall. He trusted his systems, he trusted his vizier, and he trusted that the future was something that could be negotiated with patience. Under his rule, history didn't feel like it was rushing toward a cliff. It felt like it was finally settling into a long, peaceful afternoon. This was the Golden Age, a brief span of time where power and culture moved in a rare, perfect harmony. For those living under Seljuk rule, the world felt expansive, yet safe. The future wasn't a threat, it was an opportunity. This was the quiet miracle of Malik Shah's reign. He gave the world a sense of balance. But as every traveller knows, the sun eventually reaches its peak and begins its descent. Beneath the surface of this golden age, the shadows were already beginning to lengthen. Ambitions were not dead. They were merely sleeping. Old rivalries were waiting for the steady hand of the Sultan to falter. Even Nizam al-Mulk, in his final years, knew that order is a fragile thing that requires constant, exhausting care. For now, though, the empire stood luminous and proud, a beacon of stability in a fractured world. It was a moment in time when strength served the people, and when a tribe of riders from the north proved that they could build a civilization that would be remembered as long as there were stories to tell. The death of Malik Shah in 1092 did not arrive with the roar of a battlefield or the tolling of a great bell. It came in a quiet moment of illness, leaving behind an empire that had grown so used to his steady hand that it had forgotten how to stand on its own. For 20 years his presence had been the stone that held the arch together. Now that stone was gone, leaving only a hollow silence, and into that silence the ancient hungry ghost of ambition rushed back. Power, when left unguarded, is a poison. The Seljuk realm did not shatter like glass falling on stone. Instead, it began to unravel like a piece of old silk. In the palace hallways and distant frontier garrisons, brothers, cousins, and generals began to eye one another with a new, cold calculation. The question of who would sit on the throne was no longer a matter of law, but a mirror in which every ambitious man saw his own face crowned. The authority that had once flowed from a single centre in Isfahan began to spray outward, scattering into a dozen different directions. Rival princes rose up, each backed by factions desperate for their own slice of the empire. Courts that had once hummed with the shared work of governance now became nests of whispers and locked doors. Decisions that once took a day now took months of negotiation. The sheer size of the empire, once its greatest pride, became its greatest curse. A command sent from the centre might take weeks to reach the Syrian border, and by the time the rider arrived, the governor there might have already switched his cloak and his loyalty. Civil war didn't arrive with a single declaration. It crept into the world through small betrayals and midnight skirmishes. Cities that had once been open and prosperous now began to thicken their walls. Neighbours who had traded for years now watched each other across newly drawn borders. The empire was fighting itself, and the resources that should have been spent on schools and roads were now being poured into the fire of internal conflict. But while the princes fought with armies, another force was rising from the shadows, one that didn't need 1,000 men to change history. High in the jagged Alborz mountains of Persia, in a fortress called Alamut, or the Eagle's Nest, a man named Hassan-i Sabah had begun a very different kind of war. His followers, the Nizari Ismailis, known to history as the Assassins, did not march in the sunlight. They did not care for territory or titles. Their power lay in a terrifying surgical precision. They understood that you didn't need to defeat an army if you could simply remove the man who commanded it. They were ghosts in the machine of the empire, a fruit seller in the market, a servant in a hallway, or even a trusted guard might suddenly reveal themselves as an instrument of Alamut. Their method was not just murder, it was theatre. They struck in public places, often inside crowded mosques on a Friday or in the middle of a busy court, using nothing but a small concealed dagger. The goal was to leave a message: no one is safe, no wall is high enough, no guard is loyal enough. For the Seljuks, this was a threat they were never trained to fight. They were warriors of the open sky and the wide plain. They had no defense against a blade that came from the person standing right next to them. This invisible war began to eat away at the very heart of the empire. Trust, the invisible glue that holds a society together, began to dissolve. Leaders grew isolated, hiding behind triple-locked doors, yet knowing that even their own shadow might betray them. The darkest blow fell even before Malik Shah had passed. The great architect of the empire, the vizier Nizam al-Mulk, was the assassin's first major target. In 1092, while he was travelling in a litter, a man dressed as a Sufi mystic approached him, as if to offer a petition. In a heartbeat, the dagger found its mark. The death of the vizier was more than just a tragedy. It was a structural collapse. The brain of the empire was gone. Without his steady hand, the complex systems of tax, justice, and communication began to fail. Coordination weakened, and the personal rivalries of the princes turned into a permanent state of chaos. The empire's enemies didn't need to scale the walls of Isfahan. The walls were being torn down from the inside. Armies that had once stood together at Manzikert now faced each other across the dusty plains of Persia and Iraq. The borders grew porous. While the Seljuks looked inward, their neighbours began to look outward. To the west, the Byzantine Empire saw the smoke of the Seljuk civil wars and began to hope for a return to their lost lands. Further away in the cathedrals and castles of Europe, rumours of this eastern chaos were reaching ears that were already dreaming of a holy war. Yet, for the ordinary person, the weaver in the bazaar or the farmer in the field, the change was slow, the market still opened, and the scholars still taught. But the air was different. The sense of being part of a great unified civilization was fading into a memory. Stability now existed only in small pockets, guarded by local lords who cared more for their own fortress than the Sultan's glory. The assassins thrived in this broken world. Their network spread like a vine through the cracks of the empire, exploiting every grievance and every division. They didn't seek to rule the empire, they sought to paralyze it, and they succeeded. By the time the Seljuk leaders realized they needed to unite against this threat, the damage was already done. You cannot fix a house while the builders are afraid of their own shadows. The Seljuk Empire had been built on a delicate balance. The Turkic sword protecting the Persian pen. Now the sword was turned against itself, and the pen was broken. This era of turmoil did not erase the beauty of the Golden Age, but it cast a long, cold shadow over it. The empire was still standing, but it was no longer a single, solid tree. It was a forest of divided branches swaying in a rising wind. As the Seljuk princes squabbled over the remains of Malik Shah's dream, they failed to notice the horizon. To the west, the first knights of the Crusades were already putting their feet in their stirrups. The internal fracture was about to meet an external hammer, and the world was about to enter a fire that would last for 200 years. While the Seljuk princes were busy tearing at the edges of their own inheritance, a storm was brewing in a world they barely recognized. News of this distant threat did not arrive as a single clear warning. Instead, it filtered in through the accounts of weary merchants and sun-scorched pilgrims. Stories that grew stranger and more terrifying with every retelling in the bazaars of Damascus and Aleppo. In the cities of Syria and Anatolia, the ruling elite paid little mind. They were far too occupied with their own mountain fortresses and palace intrigues to worry about the Franks from the cold, damp lands of the far west. They did not yet realize that the world as they knew it was about to be cut open. In Europe, a continent long defined by its own fractures, something unprecedented had happened. A single call to arms had unified lords and peasants alike under a banner of red crosses and heavy iron. They were men who spoke a dozen different tongues but shared a single, burning conviction. To the Seljuk scouts watching from the hills of Anatolia, this was not an army in the way they understood it, disciplined, mobile, and led by a single sultan. To them, the Crusaders looked like a slow-moving force of chaos, a sprawling tide of steel-clad knights and desperate commoners who seemed to have no home to return to. By the time the Seljuks realized this was not merely a raid, but an invasion of the mind and the soul, the gates of the east were already beginning to buckle. The Seljuk Empire, which had stood as a wall under Arslan, was now a patchwork of squabbling territories. In Syria and Palestine, power was held by local atabegs, military governors who cared more about their neighbours' territory than the survival of the caliphate. Jerusalem itself had become a prize that changed hands like a common coin, passed between the Seljuks and the Fatimids of Egypt. When the Crusaders arrived, they found a house that was not just divided, but one where the brothers were actively hoping for each other's failure. As the knights pressed into the heart of Anatolia, the Seljuks fought with their traditional bravery. They used the tactics of the steppe, the feigned retreat, the midnight raid, and the relentless hail of arrows from horseback. But the old magic was failing. Without a central command, these victories were isolated and hollow. A win in one valley was forgotten because the neighbouring governor refused to send reinforcements. The Crusaders, despite their heavy armour and their exhaustion, possessed a grim, unified momentum that the fractured Seljuks simply could not match. The march turned southward into Syria, and the horror of the situation finally became undeniable. Cities like Antioch, which had stood for centuries as monuments of stone and culture, fell after grueling, bloody sieges. Some local Seljuk rulers, seeing the writing on the wall, tried to negotiate for their own survival, while others fought until their garrisons were nothing but dust. Betrayal became more common than bravery. The peak of the tragedy came in 1099, with the fall of Jerusalem. The siege was short and the aftermath was a nightmare that would haunt the collective memory of the East for centuries. For the Seljuks, the loss of the Holy City was more than a territorial defeat. It was a spiritual humiliation. It revealed the true cost of their internal wars. They hadn't been defeated by a superior civilization, but by their own inability to remember who they were. The guardians of the faith had let the gate remain unlocked while they argued over the keys, yet the Crusaders were not the invincible force they appeared to be. Once the initial shock of their arrival passed, the Seljuk leaders began to notice the cracks in the Frankish armour. The Crusaders struggled to rule the lands they had seized. They were strangers in a harsh climate, surrounded by a population that viewed them as intruders. Their own alliances were as fragile as Glass and their leaders began to quarrel over the spoils of war just as the Seljuks had. In response, the Seljuk world began a slow, painful process of adaptation. Where unity was impossible, a desperate cooperation took its place. Regional commanders began to share intelligence and monitor the supply routes of the Crusader states. They stopped trying to win the war in a single day and began a long game of attrition. They learned the rhythms of these new enemies, their heavy, slow movements, their reliance on stone fortresses, and their deep-seated impatience. The relationship between the two worlds became strange and complex. It wasn't always a matter of blood and steel. Between the battles, there were long stretches of tense diplomacy. Treaties were signed in silk-draped tents. Prisoners were traded for gold, and trade, ever the survivor, continued to flow across the front lines. A Seljuk merchant might sell grain to a Crusader castle one day, and guide an army to its gates the next. In the quiet moments, both sides watched each other with a wary, distant curiosity, realizing that neither was going anywhere anytime soon. Despite the early losses, the Seljuk spirit proved remarkably resilient. The cities of the interior adapted to the reality of a permanent frontier. A new generation of leaders began to emerge, men who had been born into this world of conflict and understood that survival required more than just courage. It required a cold, calculating patience. The shock of the invasion gradually settled into a grinding, multi-generational contest of endurance. The Crusades would not end in their lifetime. They became a permanent feature of the landscape, like the mountains or the deserts. For the Seljuks, this era was a hard, bitter lesson. They learned that an external enemy will always find the cracks left by internal pride. They learned that a wall is only as strong as the men who stand upon it together. As the decades passed, the Seljuks' role in the world began to shift. They were no longer the sole emperors of the East, but they remained the bedrock of the response. Their military strategies and their administrative systems became the foundation for the great leaders who would eventually follow, such as Zengi and Saladin. Even as their own central authority continued to wane, the imprint of their resistance remained carved into the history of the region. The legacy of these conflicts was not written in the blood of the battlefields alone. It reshaped the very borders of the soul. It forced the East to look at itself and realize that fragmentation was a luxury they could no longer afford. For the Seljuks, the Crusades were a turning point, not the end, but a revelation. The empire that had once expanded with the confidence of a summer flood was now a river being forced into a narrower, deeper channel. As the sun set over the fortified hills of Syria, the Seljuk world stood at a crossroads. They were tested, they were bloodied, and they were changed forever. The world around them was no longer the one Arslan had conquered, but in the struggle to keep what remained, they were finding a new, grimmer kind of strength. Empires rarely fall with a single crash. More often, they simply begin to loosen, slowly, quietly, until the threads that once held millions of people together start to fray. For the Seljuks, this wasn't a story of a great defeat on a battlefield. It was a story of distance. It was the distance between a sultan's decree in the capital and a governor's reality in a mountain pass. It was the gap between the grand idea of a unified empire and the daily, grinding necessity of local survival. After years of internal squabbling and the heavy hammer of the Crusades, the central Seljuk court in Isfahan felt increasingly remote. On the maps drawn by scholars, the empire still looked like a vast, solid giant, but in reality, the weight of that giant was becoming impossible to carry. Unity, once something that could be commanded with a word, now had to be negotiated with 1,000 different voices. Governors still ruled in the Sultan's name, but they stopped asking for his permission. What had once been a system of loyal delegation turned into a quiet, stubborn autonomy. In many parts of the empire, this didn't feel like a rebellion. It felt like common sense. A local leader in Syria or Iraq couldn't wait weeks for a messenger to return from the capital while an enemy was at his gates. He had to raise his own taxes, build his own walls, and dispense his own justice. As the central oversight grew cold and quiet, these local lords simply filled the empty space. They still spoke of the Seljuk house with respect in their Friday prayers, but in their own courts their word was the only law that mattered. This was the age of the Atabegs. Originally, these men were tutors and guardians for young Seljuk princes, but as the empire fractured, they became the true masters of the land. Small, semi-independent states began to bloom across the landscape like wildflowers after a spring rain. Each city and province began to follow its own course, speaking the Seljuk tongue and keeping the Seljuk style but looking after only its own borders. Alliances were now made between neighbours, and sadly, so were wars. Nowhere was this drifting apart more obvious than in the rugged hills of Anatolia. After the victory at Manzikert, the flow of Turkic families into these western lands had never stopped. But Anatolia was a world of its own, a frontier shaped by the jagged peaks of the Taurus Mountains and constant contact with the Byzantines and the Crusaders. Isfahan was thousands of miles away, across deserts and high passes. For the leaders in Anatolia, the central sultan's problems felt as distant as the stars. They had their own battles to fight and their own cities to build. From this independence, the Sultanate of Rum was born. It was Seljuk in its blood, but Anatolian in its soul. Its rulers didn't just conquer, they settled. They built their own roads, minted their own coins, and created a state that was culturally Turkic and Islamic, yet distinct from the empire of their cousins in the east. What had started as a frontier outpost had grown into a kingdom in its own right, leaving the parent empire behind without ever officially saying goodbye. Back in the Heartlands, the central authority was struggling just to stay relevant. Succession disputes were no longer just family arguments, they were structural earthquakes. Every time a sultan died, the empire held its breath as rival princes tore at the remains of the treasury. The court, once a place of brilliant governance under Nizam al-Mulk, was becoming a stage for survival and desperate manoeuvring. The economy began to fracture along with the politics. The Silk Road still carried its silk and spices, but the tax money that once filled the Sultan's vaults was now being diverted into local treasuries. The great irrigation canals and bridges that needed coordinated imperial repair began to crumble. Prosperity didn't vanish, it just became local. A city with a strong governor might still thrive, but the sense of a shared imperial economy was fading away. The administrative machines built during the Golden Age didn't stop, but they lost their momentum. A system relies on a clear voice from the top to keep it moving. Without it, the laws became uneven, and the officials grew cautious. No one knew whose order would still be valid by the time the moon changed. Justice, which used to be the pride of the Seljuks, was now whatever the local lord decided it should be. This decentralization didn't always look like a tragedy. In some places, being on their own actually brought a kind of stability. A local ruler knew his people better than a distant sultan ever could. In these pockets, culture still flourished and markets still buzzed with life. But beneath this surface lay a deep vulnerability, because the empire was no longer a single, solid wall. It could no longer respond to a great threat. When a new danger arose, coordination was slow and painful. When a dispute broke out between two provinces, there was no longer a single judge who could end it. The empire's greatest strength, its massive scale, had turned into its greatest weakness. Power that is spread too thin is power that cannot be felt when it is needed most. The Seljuk name still carried a heavy weight of legitimacy. It was a name that commanded respect in the mosques and fear in the hearts of enemies who remembered the stories of Arslan. But the name no longer guaranteed unity. Foreign powers began to sense the change. The Byzantines stopped looking for a great army on the horizon and started looking for ways to play one local lord against another. The Crusader states settled into their coastal fortresses, realizing they were no longer facing an empire but a collection of angry neighbors. And further to the east, new rivals watched the distance between Seljuk prestige and Seljuk reality, waiting for the right moment to strike. For the Seljuks themselves, this was a time of quiet, weary adjustment. The dream of a universal empire was receding, replaced by the practical, smaller reality of regional rule. Grandeur was being traded for survival. History usually marks the end of an empire with a great fire or a final bloody battle. But for those living through these years, it didn't feel like ruin. It felt like compromise. It felt like learning to live with smaller horizons and less certainty. It was the gradual narrowing of a world that had once seemed to have no limits. The empire was still there. The schools were open, the mosques were full, and the soldiers still wore their armor. But the invisible heartbeat that had moved the whole giant from a single center was fading into a faint, scattered rhythm. The Seljuk world was entering a new phase, one where they would have to learn how to survive not as a single, mighty empire, but as a collection of parts, each trying to hold on to its own piece of the sky. While the borders of the empire shifted like sand in a desert wind, and the central authority began to fragment, another Seljuk story was being written. This one didn't move with the thunder of hooves or the clatter of steel. It moved quietly, through the cool corridors of stone schools, the hushed workshops of master weavers, and along the dusty roads where travellers rested beside their weary camels. Even as the political map of the Seljuks began to pull apart, the intellectual life they had planted was just beginning to bloom, proving to be far more durable than any throne. In the cities of Persia and Anatolia, learning was not just a pursuit, it was a form of stability. At dawn, before the heat of the day could bake the city streets, students would gather beneath the shaded arches of the great mosques. You could see their breath in the sharp morning air as they waited for their masters to arrive. Some clutched worn manuscripts, their edges softened by years of touch. Others sat, with nothing but their own focused attention, relying on the ancient art of memory. The teachers spoke in low, measured tones, their voices drifting over the sound of fountains murmuring in the courtyards. Knowledge here was a living thing, something to be argued over, lived with, and carried across a lifetime. The Nizamiya schools were the heart of this movement. Founded by the Great Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, they were the world's first true universities. In these halls, ideas travelled as freely as people. A student might arrive from a small village in the mountains of Khorasan, stay for years to master the complexities of law or mathematics, and then depart for a distant city in Syria. They carried with them more than just facts. They carried a shared way of thinking. A legal debate begun in a shaded room in Isfahan might find its way months later into a courthouse in Baghdad, reshaped by new voices but still connected by the same Seljuk foundation. The Persian language became the skin that held this world together. It wasn't just for poets. It was the language of the ledgers, the court, and the scientist. For the Seljuks, adopting Persian was not a loss of their Turkic identity. It was a bridge. It allowed these sons of the steppe to enter a conversation that had been going on for 1,000 years. Through Persian, they could speak to the ghosts of ancient kings and the scholars of future generations. In the courts of the sultans and the local governors, the scholars were the quiet architects of power. They didn't just teach, they advised. A ruler's decision was often shaped by long, late-night discussions about justice, responsibility, and the history of those who had ruled before. Power in the Seljuk world was beginning to learn how to listen. Architecture was the most visible proof of this new balance. Along the great trade routes, the caravanserais rose like islands of safety in a dangerous world. At night, inside these massive stone walls, the fires flickered as merchants from across the globe shared a meal. Here the animals settled into a rare silence, and the scholars travelling between cities would find themselves debating philosophy with silk traders from China. These roads moved more than just spices and gold. They moved the very thoughts of the age. The mosques and madrasas were built not to overwhelm the viewer with their size, but to invite them into a sense of order. Their courtyards offered a rare pause from the noise of the bazaar, and their thick walls absorbed the weight of centuries of debate. In these spaces, faith and science did not fight. They lived side by side. The work of the mind continued even as the empire's borders were tested. Physicians in Seljuk hospitals practiced medicine based on careful observation, moving away from superstition towards science. Astronomers sat on rooftops measuring the slow, elegant dance of the stars to map the heavens. Philosophers wrestled with the deep questions of reason and belief, often working by the light of a single oil lamp until the sun began to rise. This work didn't need a parade or a proclamation. It only needed the patronage that the Seljuks provided with a steady hand. Literature too found a new rhythm. Poetry didn't just live in books. It was heard in the streets and remembered by heart. It captured the longing for the open steppe, the beauty of a Persian garden, and the quiet devotion of the soul. These stories weren't just for the elite in their silk robes. They were the shared property of everyone who spoke the tongue. Even when the wars grew loud and the cities were threatened, this quieter life endured. When a court fell, the library often survived. When a war ended, the scholars were the first to return to the charred remains of their classrooms to begin again. The Seljuk world remained intellectually connected even when it was politically broken. This resilience was perhaps the empire's greatest gift to the future. Later, empires, like the Ottomans and the Safavids, would inherit more than just the land. They would inherit these habits of thought, these systems of learning, and this expectation that a ruler must also be a patron of the mind. The Seljuks had proven that true authority is not found in the sword alone, but in the understanding that follows it. In this way, the Seljuk Empire lived two lives. One was the visible life of conquest, decline, and shifting borders. The other was the quiet life of the pen and the stone. The first would eventually end, as all empires must, but the second would continue, carried not by soldiers, but by people. As night settles over the cities built and rebuilt by Seljuk hands, the lamps in the study hall still burn. The pens move slowly across the pages, and the voices in the courtyard soften, but they do not fall silent. The empire, though it was changing, never stopped thinking. And in its thinking, it found a way to live forever. By the early years of the 12th century, the Seljuk Empire no longer moved with the restless, hungry confidence of its youth. If you looked at a map in the libraries of Baghdad, the borders still looked vast, stretching across the horizon like a sleeping giant. The name Seljuk still carried a heavy weight of authority in the mosques, but the raw energy that had once pushed their banners across continents had slowed to a cautious crawl. What followed was not a sudden, crashing end, but an era of long, quiet endurance, a time of rulers who understood that they were no longer architects of a new world, but caretakers of an old one that was slowly slipping through their fingers. Among these men were sultans like Muhammad Tapa and later Mahmud II. Muhammad Tapa did not inherit a kingdom. He inherited a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces no longer fit together. To the north and west, provinces acted as if the central court didn't exist. Local military leaders, once loyal servants of the crown, now guarded their own gates and pocketed their own taxes. Tughril and Arslan had ruled from a throne of unquestioned dominance, but Muhammad Tapa had to rule from a position of delicate, exhausting balance. Every day was a negotiation. He had to remind his governors and generals, through silver, through marriage, and sometimes through the threat of the blade, that the House of Seljuk still stood above their personal ambitions. He worked methodically, like a man trying to repair a dam in a rainstorm. He reinforced old alliances and confronted those who dared to claim his title. He asserted his authority where he could, but more often he negotiated for it where he had to. These efforts didn't bring back the golden unity of the past, but they did something just as important. They slowed the disintegration. For a brief moment, the central power of the Sultan seemed to steady itself, and the empire felt like a single thing once again. This was leadership born of ship, necessity, not of grand dreams. Muhammad Tapa understood that the days of sweeping across Anatolia or reshaping the heart of Persia were over. Survival now depended on the cold math of calculation and the preservation of what was left. He leaned heavily on the old Persian administrative systems that still hummed beneath the surface. The machinery of state that Nizam al-Mulk had built decades ago was still turning. Clunky and imperfect, perhaps, but it was the only thing keeping the world from falling into total chaos. After Muhammad's death, Mahmud II stepped into a world that was even more fragile. His reign was a constant high-stakes game of pressure. His authority was challenged at every turn by regional lords who had grown comfortable in their independence. For Mahmud, every decision was a gamble. If he used too much force to bring a rebel to heel, he risked a wider uprising. If he used too little, he was seen as weak. His life was not one of imperial glory, but of constant, weary vigilance. He did what he could to keep the idea of a great Seljuk Empire alive. He called for grand councils and issued beautifully written decrees, trying to use the Sultanate as a symbol that could still unify the people. But the reality on the ground was stubborn. Loyalty was no longer a given. It was something that had to be bought or traded for every single season. But while the Seljuks were looking at their own internal fractures, a new shadow was beginning to stretch across the world from the far eastern horizon. It started with whispers. Merchants arriving at the city gates of Merv and Samarkand brought stories that seemed impossible. They spoke of a vast, unstoppable force reshaping the lands beyond the Oxus. They spoke of cities being erased from the earth and armies that moved like the wind. At first, these accounts felt like the tall tales of travellers, distant and unreal. But slowly, the rumours hardened into a cold certainty. The Mongols had not yet arrived, but their reputation was already chilling the air of the marketplace. The Seljuk Empire, already tired and strained, now faced a threat unlike anything it had ever seen. Preparation was almost impossible. Because the empire was so fragmented, there was no way to coordinate a single massive defense. Resources were trapped in regional treasuries, and the princes were too busy watching each other to watch the horizon. Yet, remarkably, the empire endured, not through military strength, but through the sheer weight of its own inertia. It continued to exist simply because nothing had yet arrived to knock it over. The court still functioned, the market still traded, and the Sultan still wore his robes of state. During this period, Seljuk power became more about the idea of empire than the practice of it. The Sultanate was a link to a more stable, unified past, a symbolic bridge that kept the various parts of the world feeling connected. In the cities, life went on. Scholars still taught in the madrasas, and trade still flowed along the Silk Road, even if the soldiers guarding the road now wore the colours of a local lord instead of the Sultan. The decline wasn't felt everywhere at once. In some provinces, the local people barely noticed that the great Sultan was losing his grip. They focused on their own walls and their own harvests, but the larger pattern was impossible to hide from those who knew where to look. The empire was no longer shaping the world. It was simply reacting to it. Muhammad Tapa and Mahmud II should not be remembered as failures. They were the caretakers of a legacy that was already under immense strain before they were even born. They ruled at a moment when greatness could no longer be won back, only protected for a few more years. Their endurance bought time for the Persian culture, the Islamic laws, and the Turkic traditions to sink so deeply into the soil that they would survive long after the Seljuk name had faded. The Seljuk Sultanate lived through these years by adapting to its own weakness. It moved from being a dominant force to being a resilient one. It carried the traditions of the Golden Age forward, acting as a bridge to the new empires that would eventually rise from its ruins. As the eastern horizon grew dark with the approach of the Mongols, the the Seljuk world stood suspended between a memory of what it was and the uncertainty of what was to come. The last great sultans had held the line as best they could. The empire was still there, but the fire at its centre was cooling, and the future would no longer be written by the hand of a sultan in Isfahan. Long after the dust of the Battle of Manzikert had settled into the soil of the plains, the world it created was still quietly unfolding. What had begun as a single afternoon of clashing steel had turned, over the passing of decades, into something much deeper. The slow, steady transformation of a landscape. Anatolia, for centuries a jagged frontier fought over by empires, was gradually becoming something else. It was becoming a home. The migration of the Turks into these western lands was not a single, roaring wave. It was more like a rising tide that moved through the valleys and over the hills for generations. Turkic families followed the mountain passes first mapped out by their scouts, bringing with them their herds of sheep, their ancient traditions and memories of a flat, endless steppe. But the world they found here was different. Instead of open grasslands, they encountered deep forests and high, rocky plateaus. They found ancient stone villages tucked into hidden valleys, where Roman roads, weathered but still straight, lay half buried beneath the earth. They saw Christian churches standing beside abandoned fortresses and fields that still bore the deep furrows of centuries of Roman and Byzantine ploughing. Settlement required a different kind of strength, the strength to adapt. The Seljuks who entered Anatolia learned that they could not simply impose the life of the steppe on this new land. They had to learn its rhythms. The seasonal movement of the nomads began to soften into permanence. The grey felt tents were slowly replaced by houses of stone and wood, and those houses eventually grew into towns. Over time, a new identity began to take shape, one that was physically separated from the great Seljuk heartlands in the east by thousands of miles of desert. This was the birth of the Sultanate of Rum. The name Rum was a nod to the land they now held, the land of the Romans. Its rulers were Seljuks by blood, but their authority was rooted in Anatolian soil. They governed from cities like Konya and Sivas, places that blended old Byzantine foundations with the new, soaring lines of Islamic architecture. Their courts didn't have the grand, universal ambitions of the great sultans in Isfahan. Instead, they possessed a frontier sensibility, pragmatic, alert, and deeply flexible. They weren't trying to rule the world. They were trying to build a stable life in a land that was still defined by contest. Relations with the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople were never simple. It was a relationship of constant shifting layers, sometimes marked by the sharp edge of a sword, and sometimes by the soft rustle of a silk treaty. The boundary between the Seljuk and Byzantine worlds was rarely a fixed line on a map. It was a zone where both sides lived, traded, and sometimes even married into one another's families. Then came the Crusaders. For the Sultanate of Rum, the arrival of these Western armies added a terrifying new layer to the frontier. Anatolia became a massive, dangerous bridge for foreign knights marching toward the Holy Land. The Seljuk rulers of Rum learned to navigate this new world with a cold, calculated caution. They learned when it was better to resist, and when it was wiser to simply step aside and allow the tide to pass. This experience hardened their governance, making them some of the most skilled diplomats and survivors of the age. But it was not war that truly defined the Sultanate of Rum. It was synthesis. The Seljuks of Anatolia ruled over a world that was a beautiful, crowded mix of people. In the markets of Konya, you would hear a dozen different tongues: Greek, Armenian, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. Rather than trying to erase this diversity, the rulers of Rum leaned into it. They kept local Christian administrators in their jobs, and they preserved the ancient agricultural systems that had fed the land for 1,000 years. Architecture became the most striking proof of this blending. New mosques rose beside old cathedrals, and often the two styles began to bleed into one another. Seljuk stonework in Anatolia developed a look found nowhere else. The intricate geometric patterns of the East carved with the heavy, solid techniques of the Byzantine West. Along the trade routes, they built the great caravanserais of Rum, vast, fortified stone halls that were among the most welcoming and sophisticated inns in the medieval world. They turned Anatolia into a bridge that connected the wealth of the Silk Road to the ports of the Mediterranean. In this environment, identity changed quietly. The people who lived there stopped seeing themselves as just migrants or conquerors. They became inhabitants. They were Anatolian Seljuks. The rulers encouraged this by building great centres of learning and patronising poets who wrote of both the distant grasslands and the rugged beauty of their new home. As the years passed, the Sultanate of Rum grew into a prosperous, resilient power. While the Great Seljuk Empire in the east began to fade under the weight of its own divisions, the Anatolian Seljuks endured. They had built something that was smaller in scale, but much more deeply rooted in the earth. Their rule laid a foundation that would outlast the Seljuk name, shaping the culture, the law, and the very face of Anatolia for centuries to come. The Sultanate of Rum didn't try to recreate the past. They accepted that the world had changed, and they worked to make that change livable. They preserved the Seljuk legacy not as a dusty memory of the steppe, but as a living, breathing practice, embedded in the stone of their towns, the stones of their roads, and the daily rhythms of a land that was no longer a frontier but a heartland. In this quiet transformation, the Seljuk story found one of its most enduring afterlives, a bridge made of stone and spirit that would eventually lead to the rise of the Ottomans and the birth of a new era. The end of the Seljuk Empire did not arrive with the roar of a final battle or the dramatic fall of a single city. It arrived the way a winter storm moves across the steppe, slowly at first, almost unnoticed, until the frost has turned the soil to iron and the world is changed beyond recognition. By the time the Seljuk princes understood the true weight of the shadow approaching from the east, the ground they stood upon was already crumbling. The empire wasn't just being conquered, it was being erased. The Mongols did not announce themselves with a parade. They came first as rumours, strange low-voiced stories told by merchants who arrived at the city gates with trembling hands. They spoke of cities that had been wiped from the face of the earth, of armies that moved with a speed that defied logic, and of an enemy that met resistance with total annihilation. At first, these tales felt like the fever dreams of terrified travellers, but as the smoke on the eastern horizon grew thicker, the rumours hardened into a cold, lethal certainty. When the Mongol tide finally arrived, it brought a form of war that the Seljuks were utterly unprepared to face. It wasn't just about steel, it was about a relentless, terrifying coordination. The Seljuk territories, fractured by decades of internal pride and local bickering, could not find a single voice to answer the threat. They fell one by one, like trees in a gale. It wasn't always a matter of losing a battle. Often, it was simply the realization that the old world had no more room for them. The great Seljuk Sultanate, already hollowed out by its own civil wars, finally broke apart under this external hammer. What remained of the central authority in Isfahan simply dissolved into the air. The courts scattered, the ancient titles lost their meaning, and the banners that had once signalled the King of the East and West were lowered for the last time. The empire that had once stretched across continents was now a ghost, living only in the memories of those who could still recall the days of Malik Shah. In the silence left behind, new powers began to stir. In the east, the Khwarezmian dynasty rose briefly, inheriting the land, the palaces, and the problems of the Seljuks. They adopted the Seljuk way of doing things, the court style, the military ranks, the administrative habits, trying to stand as a final barrier between the civilization of the West and the storms of the East. It was an intense, desperate reign that functioned as a bridge, though it too would eventually be swept away by the same Mongol wind. In Anatolia, the story took a different, more resilient turn. The Sultanate of Rum was shaken to its core by the Mongol advance, especially after the Battle of Kosedag in 1243. But it didn't vanish overnight. Instead, it fragmented into dozens of smaller pieces known as the Anatolian Beyliks. These were small, local principalities, each centered on a single city, a mountain valley or a fertile plain. They were gritty and pragmatic, governed by leaders who were more concerned with the survival of their people than the grandeur of an empire. Though the Sultanate was politically broken, these Beyliks carried the Seljuk fire in their lanterns, keeping the traditions alive in smaller, more intimate forms. Seljuk political power, as a single unified force, was finished. No sultan would ever again command the breadth of authority that had once moved the world from Baghdad to Isfahan. The era of the great Seljuks had passed into the pages of history. Yet, something stubborn remained. The Seljuks had left behind far more than just lines on a map. Their institutions, the way they managed taxes, the way they built schools, and the way they governed through a mix of Turkic strength and Persian wisdom did not die with the sultans. These systems outlived their creators, continuing to function under new rulers who realized they couldn't find a better way to run a state. The roads the Seljuks had paved and the caravanserais they had built continued to shelter the world's trade long after the names of Tughril or Chaghri Beg were forgotten by the travellers who slept within their walls. Architecture proved to be their most durable testament. Across the landscape, Seljuk mosques and madrasas stood in quiet defiance of the change. Their heavy stone portals and intricate brickwork absorbed the passing of centuries, becoming a permanent part of the land itself. Later generations didn't tear them down. They used them, repaired them, and built their own dreams beside them. The Seljuks no longer ruled from the throne, but they still spoke through the stone. The culture they had fostered, the blending of Turkic, Persian, and Islamic identities, became the foundation for everything that followed. The Persian language remained the tongue of the heart and the scholar, and the Seljuk way of being became a regional inheritance that would eventually find a new, even more powerful expression in the rise of the Ottoman Empire. For the ordinary person, the merchant in the bazaar or the farmer tending his olive trees, the end of the Seljuk era didn't feel like a sudden collapse. It felt like a shift in the wind. The taxes were paid to a different man, and the names in the Friday prayers changed. But life continued to follow the habits and rhythms that the Seljuks had established over 200 years. The empire had faded, but its heartbeat was still there, pulsing beneath the surface of the new world. History usually focuses on the moment an empire falls, the fire, the rubble, and the loss of power. But the Seljuks are remembered most truthfully by how they lasted after they were gone. They were the ones who had turned nomadic warriors into architects and philosophers. They had bridged the gap between the steppe and the city without destroying either. They had shown the world that power could be a shared project between the sword and the pen. When the Mongol storms finally passed and new states began to grow from the wreckage, the Seljuk legacy was the soil they grew in. It was unseen, uncelebrated, but absolutely unmistakable. Their political authority had ended, but their civilization had found a way to diffuse itself through the blood and the stone of the East. And so, the Seljuk story did not conclude in ruin. It concluded in diffusion, spreading across lands and generations, reshaped by everyone who inherited it. The empire was gone, but its presence lingered on every road and in every quiet courtyard waiting to be carried forward into a new age. When the last echoes of the Mongol drums finally fade and the names of the great sultans have become distant whispers in the pages of old books, we are left to ask, what actually remains of an empire? Usually it isn't what the empire said about itself in its golden age. It isn't the borders, which are always drawn in pencil by history, or the palaces, which eventually crumble back into the dust. True legacy lives in the things we no longer notice because they have become part of the air we breathe. It lives in habits, in the way a city is built, the way a law is written, and the way a people remembers its past. This is where the Seljuks truly endure. The Seljuks did not leave behind a single, unchanging state that carried their name into the modern world. Instead, they left behind a pattern. They created a blueprint for how to rule a world made of many different pieces. Nowhere is this more visible than in the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Long before the Ottomans were a world power, they were a small tribe in a world that had been deeply ploughed by Seljuk hands. The Ottoman way, that specific balance between military strength and a highly educated government, was a Seljuk invention. The role of the Sultan as a protector of the faith, the use of Persian as the language of high culture, and the system of training scholars and judges to run the state. All of these were the seeds the Seljuks had planted centuries earlier. The Ottomans didn't just replace the Seljuks, they grew out of the soil the Seljuks had prepared. Culturally, the Seljuks were the great connectors of history. They arrived as outsiders, but they had the rare wisdom to realize they didn't have to destroy what they found to be powerful. They took the ancient, refined traditions of Persia and gave them a new Turkic energy. They took the strict codes of Islamic law and integrated them into a functioning society that valued learning as much as authority. This was their greatest synthesis. They showed that a nomad from the steppe could become a custodian of a civilization without losing the grit and resilience that made him a warrior in the first place. This synthesis became the new normal for the East. It shaped the very idea of what a ruler should be. A sultan wasn't just a man who won battles, he was a man expected to protect the scholar, to build the caravanserai, and to ensure that justice reached the smallest village. The Seljuks didn't just invent these ideas, they organized them into a system that worked, a system that other empires would quietly rely upon for the next 500 years. Architecture remains the most intimate evidence of this legacy. If you walk through the cities of Iran or Anatolia today, the Seljuk buildings still stand and they still speak. They don't try to overwhelm you with their size or arrogance. Instead, they invite you inward. Their courtyards are built to encourage a moment of pause. Their intricate stone carvings reward those who have the patience to look closely. These structures were never designed just to glorify a single king. They were built to serve the community, places to pray, places to learn, and places to rest after a long journey. Long after the Seljuk name vanished from the tax records, people continued to gather within these walls, finding peace in a design they no longer knew the name of. The same can be said for their law and their governance. The Seljuk administrative models, the way they collected revenue and resolved disputes, became the skeleton for the states that followed. They proved that a lasting order requires institutions, not just strong individuals. Even when thrones were toppled and new dynasties rose, the Seljuk machinery kept running in the background, providing the continuity that allowed society to survive the storms of history. So, why do the Seljuk still matter in our time? They matter because they are a reminder that history is not just made by those who conquer most or last longest. It is made by those who connect worlds. The Seljuks were the bridge between the nomadic and the settled, the warrior and the scholar, and the East and the West. They arrived as travellers beneath an open sky. They learned, they adapted, and they built. And when their political moment finally passed, what they had made remained, useful, meaningful, and very much alive. In the end, the story of the Seljuks does not conclude with a sudden silence. It fades gently, like the sound of footsteps receding along a well-worn road, a road that others continue to walk today. Their legacy lives in the libraries that still teach their philosophy, in the mosques that still use their designs, and in the very idea that power, at its best, is used to create a space where knowledge and stability can flourish. The Seljuks did not seek immortality in the way other empires did. They didn't build giant pyramids or statues of themselves. Yet, in the quiet endurance of the world they left behind, they found a kind of immortality that no monument could ever match. The story that began in the tall grass of the steppe beneath the vast and silent sky ends here, not in ruin, but in the foundation of the world we know.